I am told that even though I am a tall mammal, I can still give this introduction, so I'm grateful for that. Our speaker today, I have known her for a number of years, so can vouch that we're hearing from the absolute best today on some topics that are, I think, incredibly fascinating and very pertinent to our Central Highlands ecoregion. So a refresher is that the title of the talk that you have chosen to attend today is called Small Mammal Conservation in Arizona, Managing Endangered Species in the Southwest. Everyone knows living in the arid Southwest is not for the faint of heart. Being an endangered animal makes it even more difficult. The Arizona Game and Fish Department conserves and manages 3 endangered small mammals: black-footed ferrets, including their prey, Gunnison's prairie dogs and black-tailed prairie dogs, Mount Graham red squirrels, and New Mexico jumping mice. Each animal lives in distinct habitats, experiences a variety of challenges, and threats are managed in very different ways. Game and Fish discusses each of these animals and how we adapt our management to emerging issues. Holly Hicks is the Small Mammal Project Coordinator for Arizona Game and Fish Department. She graduated from ASU with her BS in Conservation Biology and began work with the department in 2007 as an intern, and in her current role in 2009. Holly is also the current president, student liaison, and techniques workshop chair for the Arizona chapter of the Wildlife Society. In her spare time, she volunteers at Liberty Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, loves to run, and camp and hike with her pups. Please help me welcome Holly Hicks.
Thank you for that great introduction. Thank you, Maria. Hi, everybody. Again, I'm Holly Hicks. I am the Small Mammal Project Coordinator for Arizona Game and Fish. I've been around for about 18 years. All of my work I've done for Game and Fish has been small mammal related. I didn't destined to be a small mammal biologist, but you know how life works out sometimes. But I love what I do, and I'm really excited to talk to you guys all about some of these projects today. So one of the first questions I get asked a lot is, how do I figure out what I'm going to do with my job? How do I figure out the species I'm going to work with? And it just really comes down to a few different things. Big picture, we've got a department mission. We want to keep diverse wildlife diverse. We want a variety of our resources out there, and we want them not only now, but for the future generations. So that's the big picture of what we're looking at department-wide. My program is the Non-Game and Endangered Wildlife Program within the Terrestrial Wildlife Branch. So ours becomes a little bit more specific. We're protecting, restore, preserve, and maintaining non-game and endangered wildlife. And again, we're trying to make sure that this is for years to come. And so Arizona has what's called a wildlife conservation strategy. And every state has their own unique strategy, or a different title for it, whatever you want to call it. But it identifies the resources within the state that are either needing help or maybe are unknowns. And out of that, we create a species of greatest conservation need, and that has various tiers that have, depending on the amount of help we determine this animal might need. And so that is kind of where my job starts, looking at that species of greatest conservation need and some of these big ticket items that are on the top tier that really need to be addressed. So that's where my small mammal non-game program consists of. I have, as mentioned, 3 big ticket items as far as endangered species go. Mount Graham red squirrels, New Mexico jumping mice, black-footed ferrets, and then you can't do any work with black-footed ferrets without prairie dogs. Within the state of Arizona, we also had extirpated black-tailed prairie dogs, and so they are also a tier 1 species because we had managed to eliminate them from our state, and so we are bringing them back. So they also end up being a tier 1 species. And with each of these different projects, there's all sorts of different planning purposes that go into how we plan projects and address the needs of these animals. Sometimes there's an immense amount of information we still need, where research becomes really important. Sometimes it's just whether or not does this animal exist in this area or not, so we may just have to do a presence absence surveys to just determine is it there. Sometimes we target more individuals, their social groups, because they live in these family groups possibly, or entire populations. Sometimes it also depends on how recovery plans are built for our target goals. A lot of our animals deal with disease or limited genetics because we have small populations. So that may be an issue that we have to plan and work around. Anytime you're dealing with disease, a lot of times parasites are involved. And with disease, we've got to take a lot of care and caution, not only for the animal, but for ourselves as well, so we don't injure or harm ourselves in the process. And with disease immunizations, sometimes we have to, especially with like black-footed ferrets, we have to make sure we have animals in hand and immunize them for the various things that could be ailing them. And how do you have animals who make sure that they persist without watching and maintaining the habitat that they depend on? So the first species I'm going to talk about today is the Mount Graham red squirrel. It is a small little squirrel, actually compared to, like an arid squirrel. They're a very small tree squirrel, grayish-brown, rusty, yellowish markings on them. They have a distinct white eye ring you can see around their eye. And they are pretty small, like I said, weighing less than a pound, actually closer to about only a half a pound. So, small little critter. There are geographically 2 subspecies for Mount Graham red squirrels. For us, we are the tiny little dot that is disjunct from the rest of it right there. That is the Mount Graham red squirrel. If you guys have been out to Safford, the Pinaleños, that's where you'll find Mount Graham. So because it is geographically completely isolated on that sky island, they are going to end up having a genetic difference from the rest of the range. And so we have to manage and make sure that we maintain that habitat that does exist for this genetically distinct subspecies. Historically, we always thought of this red squirrel as being a spruce fir obligate. But after 2017, when we had the Fry Fire come through and we lost the majority of the spruce fir on the mountain, we've actually found that these animals are becoming quite adaptable to mixed conifer, which is a good thing for the squirrel. They prefer these closed canopy forests, interlocking branches. They need to be able to move around and they want a lot of cover. So they climb up a tree, they need another tree nearby so they can jump to the next one, either for resources, escaping predators, whatever the case may be. But they need a lot of that tight canopy to move around in. They cache their food in individual middens, which will come into play a little bit more later on. They were listed endangered in 1987. And they live at pretty high elevations, above 7,500 feet. And they will typically find nesting areas in their tree cavities. So, recovery goals for this squirrel require us to monitor this population over time. We have specific numbers of squirrels that we need to reach and maintain to be able to say that this animal is recovered. And so that's what we're constantly trying to investigate, is what our populations are doing and how they may be trending upwards, downwards, or at least stable. And so we restore and maintain this habitat, and we're always trying to make sure that these middens are protected. This is a midden you can see right here. It is ginormous. They have all these little holes in here where they'll stick green cones. That's what we're looking for to see if it's active or inactive. And each squirrel will have its own midden, so we can kind of determine that a population, every time we find a midden, we likely have 1 squirrel. So that's how we estimate the population. So some of them can be very obvious, like this, and some of them actually can be a little bit more discreet. Sometimes they'll use like snags and put them in snags so they can be a little bit more discreet. But ultimately, this is kind of what we're looking for as we're walking through the mountain. And that's another reason that tight canopy is super important as well. In the wintertime, you need to make sure that these stay cool so that the cones stay in good condition for them to eat over winter. So if you have a lot of exposure and the sun hitting it, it's gonna open up those cones. Those animals aren't gonna have food for winter. So that's another reason that closed canopy becomes really important. So challenges we face with the squirrel. Food availability, as I mentioned, as we have forest fires and insects and things like that that come through, there is a lot more exposure to these middens, and so sometimes food availability can be difficult in the wintertime if they can't keep that cache safe. And of course, if you have poor cone crops to begin with, if you know your trees aren't producing, that of course will be an issue. And a lot of that can come from climate change, insects, things like that, that are kind of driving some of that. One of the great things that Arizona Game and Fish thought would be to do back in, like, I think it was the 30s, was to improve hunting opportunities. So we had moved arid squirrels from, I believe it was the White Mountains, over to Mount Graham, thinking that they occupied different habitats and they wouldn't overlap and there wouldn't be any issues. Of course, Mount Graham squirrels weren't listed back then either. But, you know, animals always prove us wrong. That's what we learn in life. And now, especially with a lot of the spruce fir being gone and just a lot of the mixed conifer, their habitats have started to overlap. And they are just kind of competing for the same remaining territory. So we do some arid removals to try to open up some areas for them. So that has been a challenge as well, kind of cleaning up our own game and fish mess. When you have wildfires, you have insect outbreaks that also will create major gaps within the habitat. So you may have populations here and here and here, but they're becoming isolated because you're having fires and various things that are destroying the habitat in between. And that also then can impact the genetics as well. Once those populations become isolated, small populations definitely will have genetic bottlenecks. And so you don't want to see the genetics reduced in a small population either. So keeping connectivity between populations is also very important. So this is kind of a population map of where we've gone with our population of ferrets and some of the big things that have happened. So back in '87 is when they were listed. We've had a couple of big fires that have had some major impact on this population. And the Fry Fire, as I mentioned, was a big one. We took a big hit that year with the Fry Fire. We estimated the population to be probably 35 at the time. It was likely more, but as I'll talk about, we were probably underestimating by not looking in some of the right areas. But last year we were up to 234, so we're almost right back to where we were pre-Fry Fire. So the squirrel's proving to be pretty resilient, even with losing a lot of the best habitat. So I work with a great team of people, and we have worked on a lot of different strategies post-fire to try to make sure that those 35 squirrels would have at least what they could to rebound. And so we tried, some supplemental feeding. It was only proving so well because the bears kept raiding our caches. We did a lot of worked with the Forest Service and got LiDAR imagery to really see, assess the impacts of the fire. If anybody doesn't know, LiDAR has it's almost like lasers coming down on the ground and takes a really detailed imagery of the landscape as it goes over the mountain. It's the best way I can describe it. We've been working on, like I said, removing some of those arids in our high priority areas, insect treatments on trees to prevent some of the loss from insects that have had up there, planting trees, which many of you know it's a hard effort to try to get trees to plant. They have limited success, but keep working on that. Trying to add additional staff to address the issues. I know Game and Fish, we've had to hire additional staff to help us revise our protocol for surveying, which is also on here. We were really afraid we were going to lose everything up there, so we did take individuals into the Phoenix Zoo and started just trying to see, can we captive breed these animals? What does translocations and releases of them look like? Is it possible? So we're still very much in the research phase of some of that, trying to work out those details. And their team has also come up with a protocol if another fire breaks out, an emergency salvage. We're working with the Phoenix Zoo, how can we go up there and trap and remove as many animals as possible to prevent any certain collapse. So we've come up with any and all strategies possible to try to address as many of the issues as we could. And so far, like I said, the population's rebounding. I think we had a pretty good strategy. It seems to be working out. And you don't have to look at all the different things. I just wanted to identify these are all great partners with the Phoenix Zoo, University of Arizona doing research, Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service. It's a team of people that we all come together to get all this done, and none of us could do this alone. So it's a big effort, and we all work really hard on this together. So I think I've mentioned most of this. Yeah, we recently updated our survey method, and that is proving to be much more accurate. Prior to this, we were kind of visiting node middens because we had a pretty good idea of where all our middens were on the mountain, but as we lost everything and animals shifting around, we've completely taken a new approach as far as just transecting and surveying the entire mountain to find where they're going, and that's also proving out to be much more accurate and great. We also just finished a species status assessment with Fish and Wildlife, which is a very thorough assessment of where the animal is now compared to what it looked like historically and how we kind of plan to address some of these issues in the future. So it's a nice 100-page document that we took 4 years to finish and felt really good to have done, but it's a really, like I said, thorough assessment of where we are with the animal and how we want to move forward. So, and all of those partners mentioned in the previous slide, we meet on a monthly basis and talk about how things are going and what we can do to improve and move forward. So it's a continuous process. All right, next one, the New Mexico jumping mouse. This little guy has kind of been an up-and-comer for me. It was listed in 2014, and so it was relatively new to the endangered species world. And there was a lot of questions we had about this critter going in. As I mentioned in one of those earlier slides, research sometimes is necessary because how do you manage for something you don't know anything about? So research has been a huge component of us moving forward with this little critter. And he's a cute little mouse. Also only found in riparian areas, so would never be in your house. So this little critter is tiny. He's just a little mouse, only like 7 to 9 inches long, but it has a really long tail. And that tail is used as kind of like a rudder as it's jumping through the air. It can kind of shift directions and move itself around. It's an excellent swimmer, so it also helps when it's swimming too. So that tail is multi-purposes. It is a hibernator, a true hibernator. It will hibernate 9 months of the year. I know, it gives me a 3-month window then to get any of my work done, which isn't much. So it manages to wake up in late May, early June, get fat, breed, get fat again, and go to sleep by September. It's got a good life. It mostly eats seeds and vegetation, but also probably a few insects here and there. It's also found pretty high up and by around below at that 8,000 feet. And those big feet are pretty distinct for us. It's a habitat specialist. So it lives along riparian areas. It requires tall, dense vegetation. Within the vegetation, it doesn't really care what kind. It just needs it tall and dense. But whatever else, it just needs it to have seeds and veg, and it's good. But it has to be tall and thick, and it has to be along water. So me coming from Phoenix, it's really rough sometimes to have to go to the White Mountains and go to work. It is a very agile, mighty mouse. It not only, is walking around the ground, but it can climb. It, jumps from one piece of vegetation to the next. It swims, it dives, it can do it all. It's a pretty impressive little mouse. It also can move and shake like no other mouse I've seen. It can go up and down those strings up to a kilometer, sometimes in just a night or two. It's impressive the amount of distance this animal can travel for being so small. When we compared it to a vole occupies like this much space. Meanwhile, the jumping mice are traveling kilometers up and down. So it's pretty impressive. So as I mentioned, they want tall, dense, herbaceous vegetation. They want water. Needs to have water, saturated soils. It could be individual pools, but it has to have water along it. Part of why it's not going to be in your house. Unless, of course, you have a stream going through, which would be impressive. Here in Arizona, it's been highly associated with alder. So willows and alders up in the White Mountains. It's really good habitat for them. They like that. Beaver dams also, they create those big meadows that are very water saturated. They love those beaver dams as well. So beautiful habitat to have to go to get some work done sometimes. And this is what I'm talking about. They're only found up in the White Mountains. They designate critical habitat, which is highlighted in that kind of magenta color. So, the little Colorado River, the west and east fork of the Black River, Nutrioso Creek. Those are some of the big name areas where you can find really good habitat for New Mexico jumping mice. So our threats to this mouse are somewhat overlapped with the squirrel. I mean, climate change is impacting a lot of different things, especially a lot of our forests. So anything that's going to impact water is going to impact this mouse. So having this past winter, reduced snowpack, this monsoon we're having, not good for the jumping mouse. Like I said, they need tall, dense vegetation. So having excessive grazing can be bad, both from native ungulates and from livestock. So there's definitely a balance that can be reached between the two, but when you get to very excessive, you find these banks that get trampled and no vegetation left. Jumping mice are not going to be able to make it in that. Nothing to eat, no cover from predators, it's nothing good for them there. High severity wildfire can also, not only reduce vegetation, but after the fires, many of you know the flooding, the post-fire flooding that can happen can be very detrimental too. Can not only scour habitat, it can leave that thick film on the water. I mean, none of that is good for animals, and so it's definitely a concern when that happens. They've implied a lot of, sometimes that recreation can have impacts, and I think that is to a point. Some of our best areas where we have jumping mice are really high priority fishing areas like along the east fork of the Black River. So I think that, again, just like with the grazing, everything in moderation, excessive recreation could probably have some pretty big impacts, but people are following the same trails and just fishing. Usually it doesn't seem to have too big of a problem. And of course, loss of beaver and losing them in some of those wet meadows can have problems as well. They love those wet meadows. So some of the things that Game and Fish are doing for jumping mice, we are constantly looking at, when they were listed, they were only known to be in 14 areas in the White Mountains. And so one of their first steps was to really take a deep dive look at how many other places they could be. And so we've done that with both trapping and track plating. As I mentioned earlier, that big back foot, no other rodent in the White Mountains has a foot like that. So I have the luxury of being able to send interns out, and they can put these lovely little track plates out on the ground, and it has that felt pad across it that we put some bait on, and the animals walk through, and then they can leave a big footprint behind. And then that's how we can just presence absence, because we're not being able to establish a population estimate, but at least we know they're there or not know. And with this little guy, we have not been able to figure out how to establish an actual population number yet. So everything we work on with this animal is very habitat oriented as far as our goals go for recovery. And so we're maintaining and improving habitat. Some of that is with fencing, because as I mentioned, excessive grazing can have problems. So cattle and some of the horses up there in the White Mountains sometimes need to be fenced out. We're doing vegetation surveys in all these areas that we work to kind of really get a gauge of what areas may need more work, vegetation work. And with these vegetation surveys, we can also identify barriers, where our jumping mice are here, and the vegetation seems to be pretty poor in between. So it helps us identify where work may be needing to be done. So as I said, we wanted to go out and try to find more areas, and we sure have. We've been all over the White Mountains, and we have been able to find them in a lot more new waterways, because as I mentioned, color right here is the critical habitat. That's the only areas that we knew they existed when we start when they were listed. So we've been out and about and trying to find them in as many new spots as possible, and we've done a pretty good job. I mean, there's definitely, like I said, we've been identifying some of the areas that probably have some barriers, but it was important for us to get a good gauge of how far and wide across the landscape they really did occur. And so that was pretty impressive that they were much further and wide than we originally anticipated. And within Game and Fish, we also have 3 properties of our own that they are on that we manage. If you guys have ever been up there, Small Wildlife Area, it's a place that you can visit. It's got some wonderful trails and a stream that goes through, and we have jumping mice that are there. So yeah, they're definitely higher and wider than we thought. Populations in New Mexico struggle a lot more, but our populations in Arizona have been considered some of the more robust across the range. So we're doing pretty good here. Wish some of the places in New Mexico could as well, but they have their own issues. We have worked a lot with Northern Arizona University, Dr. Carol Chambers. She has been a huge part of the research effort for this. There were so many things we did not know about this mouse going into trying to manage. We don't know how long they live, we didn't know their home range sizes, what are they eating. So these are all questions we've been tackling over this past 10 years and have come up with some really great information. And it's been really integral to helping us figure out how to move forward with management. So just all these different things, hibernation. We had no idea where and how they were hibernating. Finding that their genetics are unique among watershed, which is super important for us to know. And like I said, they were moving a kilometer down the stream. It's quite an impressive feat for this animal. So. All right, black-footed ferrets. This one I feel like is probably one of the more high profile. A lot of people have seen, heard the story of the black-footed ferret. For those of you who don't, this animal has actually been declared extinct twice. It was listed endangered even prior to the Endangered Species Act. The last time that it was thought to be extinct, it was in Wyoming, where there was a rancher and his dog Shep had brought in this really unique animal. And Shep, the dog of course he had killed this animal, but the rancher had thought this is a really interesting little specimen. So he took it into the taxidermist. Taxidermist took one look at it, knew exactly what it was, and contacted Fish and Wildlife Service. And that's how we found this remnant population of black-footed ferrets, Shep the dog. So he's famous in my world. So that is, it's a telling tale, and we were able to go out, not to say we very loosely, I was not around back at this time, but they went out and, monitored the population for a while and quickly realized that this population was also declining. And that had been a difficult decision to make at the time, but that was when they decided to trap as many individuals as possible and bring them into captivity and try to start a breeding program, knowing that they already lost it once and they didn't want to lose it again. So, as you may or may not know, the main diet of a ferret is prairie dog. 90% of what they eat is prairie dog, and then they also depend on their burrow systems for shelter. So you will not find a prairie dog or a ferret anywhere else than on a prairie dog colony. They are nocturnal. They are mostly solitary, except during the breeding season. They have just a couple of kits a year, 3 to 5, and only have them once a year. And you'll find owls, coyotes, badgers as being their main predator. They are extremely susceptible to plague and canine distemper. And I'm sure many of you are thinking plague, oh my gosh, but it is alive and well in western United States. It came over on boats with rodents in the early 1900s. There were outbreaks in LA, San Francisco, a couple of areas across the West Coast. And it slowly spread east after that. But after the advent of antibiotics in the 30s, people really didn't hear about plague much anymore because with antibiotics, it's a pretty treatable disease. But for wildlife, it did not become such a dormant thing. It still was occurring, and you will still find it across most of the western states. A lot of times in squirrels and prairie dog colonies, mostly because they're kind of a high profile. So if you know, got a prairie dog colony that was here one day and not there the next, it's kind of obvious. It's pretty obvious that there's something wrong. So plague is a pretty big deal. There was actually a fatality in Flagstaff this year from plague. So it's definitely something that it should be on people's radar. But it's something that I think that most people don't even know occurs, and a lot of our animals in the West have not had time to evolve and have a resistance to it. So animals like the black-hooded ferret, if they even sniff a prairie dog that has got plague, they can die from it. They're extremely susceptible. They're small also, only a couple of pounds. They're about the same size as the prairie dog. Very long and slinky though. They look very much like a pet ferret, the domestics, but they are much nastier in their bite, and you will find some very distinct differences in the coloring in their face a lot of times too, that makes them unique. They only live to be about 3 to 5, mostly on the lower end of that. Males will be larger, and besides being overlapping with some males and females, they're pretty solitary. Their range, as I mentioned, overlaps all the prairie dogs across the Great Plains. We have both Arizona, bothGunnisons and black-tailed prairie dogs. And a lot of our management for finding and trapping them is spotlighting. And ferrets have this emerald green eye shine that's very unique to them, so that makes it somewhat easier to find them when you're out using your spotlights. That eye shine comes straight back at you, and it's pretty obvious, surprisingly. This next picture is a good one of it. There you can kind of see some of that green eye shine. But yeah, that's the most common survey method for them. There's some other things that I'll talk about as far as how we're moving on from that, but as far as really being able to find them and trap them, that is the #1 way that service sites across the country try to. And prairie dogs are really an indicator of habitat quality. So the more prairie dogs, the denser they are, the better quality of habitat that you will have for a ferret. And so when we are mapping and looking at our prairie dogs, we are making these lovely density maps. And that's how we really strategize our spotlighting. So the darker the color, the more dense the prairie dogs are. And so when we go out and spotlight, those are the areas we want to send people, or to where we find the densest areas of prairie dogs, and that's where we have the most success finding ferrets. They'll be active in any type of weather. So usually it's the road conditions that keep us out, if anything. And if anybody has been to Seligman, the Aubrey Valley is a very large, expansive area. It's good 30,000 acres out there, so trying to find ferrets is the needle in a haystack sometimes. So it takes a lot of time and personnel, and we've been experimenting with some other survey strategies, trying to find other ways that maybe we can be more effective in finding them. And so we have been using drones with thermal imagery, and that has been actually really cool. I've got a picture of that coming up. Scent dogs as well. We have used telemetry, so attaching radio transmitters to them and walking around with antennas and trying to find them. So I mean, these other ways have definitely have had some success, but like I said, when we actually want to trap that animal, we always seem to keep coming back to the spotlighting. And so this is what it looks like when we do the thermal imagery. That slinky little ferret just kind of slinks across the grasslands, where like if you had a bunny, it hops more, so sometimes you gotta depend a little bit on the movement of the animal, but it's pretty obvious to those of us who look at a lot of ferrets that it's a ferret. And this is a drone that we have that flies the thermal imagery camera. We also use it for some disease management work, but that's another story. And here's the scent dogs. We kind of overlap this with the telemetry. So when we knew we had animals with transmitters on them that we could track, we overlapped it with this. And this is the track of the dog as it's moving its transects across the colony. But we found that when it has an opportunity to smell every burrow, a scent dog can find a ferret 97% of the time. So it really another way to tool, again, we have 30,000 acres, it's just another way for us to kind of zone in on where to focus our efforts rather than just like 30,000 acres, go find a ferret. You know, this like narrows down some focus areas for us. So as I mentioned, 90% of their diet is prairie dog. So we can't do any ferret work without prairie dogs. And we haveGunnisons and black-tailed prairie dogs, and we manage for them both very differently. So it just sort of depends on what your focus is on how you're gonna manage for something. And forGunnisons, we have a state full of Gunnison prairie dogs, but they have to be managed as a prey also. So we have a population that we wanna make sure persists, but we also need to know, can this prey also support ferrets? So prairie dogs, they're about the same size as a ferret, so 1.5 to 2.5 pounds, and they are, as you know, live in social groups, and they're only active during the day. I always think of ferrets as kind of being lazy predators, because you've got all sorts of other things that are active at night, bunnies and little ground squirrels or rodents and things like that running around. They don't go after any of that. They go after the prairie dog that's sleeping down in the burrow, all nice and cozy. So I think that's how they're able to go after such a large rodent. Is, you know, they sneak attack them while they're sleeping. Prairie dogs themselves are also very susceptible to plague. So we spent a lot of time doing disease management, trying to keep plague is spread through rodents, mostly through the fleas that are on the rodents. And so we spend a lot of time trying to kill fleas. They're only found in the semi-arid grasslands and mountain meadows of Arizona, which is a little bit different than black-taileds. Black-taileds generally won't be in that higher elevation mountain meadows, but they definitely like the semi-arid grasslands. So there's various levels of how we're looking at them. So, as I mentioned earlier, do we just want to know they're there? Presence, absence? If that's the case, we'll go out and do a windshield survey, just pulling up on some very set locations, looking around with some binoculars. Are they here? Yes or no? Move on to the next spot. If we want to know, usually when we talk about prairie dogs, we also don't talk about numbers, population numbers. We will talk about occupied acreage. Rodents especially, it's hard to estimate a population. So we will talk about the habitat a lot. And so if we want to know how much occupied acreage there is, we'll just go and find the edge of the colony and we'll walk a circle around the prairie dog colony, and very basic way to figure out the occupied acreage for a colony. But then, as I mentioned, sometimes we get into that prey-based issue, and we need to know whether or not we're going to have enough prairie dogs that can support a population of ferrets. And that's where density mapping comes in. And so we will walk transects up and down a prairie dog colony and counting active and inactive burrows to estimate how many prairie dogs we think that we have. And it's relatively accurate, best you can with an underground rodent. And if you really need to be accurate, then you need to get into more of these more captured visual counts where you're actually tracking individuals, marking them in some way, and coming back, recapturing or following up with visual estimates. You can get really accurate in that, but it takes a lot of time and effort to do that. So it's really not feasible to do, especially on like 30,000 acres. So when we're trying to figure out our population of prairie dog, Gunnison prairie dogs for the state, we heavily lean towards the perimeter mapping, and we'll go out with interns and we can map the prairie dogs that way across the statewide. But then when we get to our ferret release sites, that's when we go to the more the density mapping and visual counts, so we can be much more accurate in our estimates. And really range wide, with all of our 4 states where you findGunnisons, we also will do occupancy surveys. That's a very, it's also just looking at a trend in the population. We do those with the 4 states that have Gunnison's prairie dogs. We do those every 3 years just to keep an eye on trends in the population. Prairie dogs are not listed themselves, but they are pretty consistently petitioned to be. They occupy about 5% of the habitat that they did historically, so there are certain environmental groups that think that they deserve listing. I'm not going to make an opinion on that one way or the other. So because they are consistently petitioned to be listed, we always want to have current information to give to Fish and Wildlife Service so they can make informed decisions on when those petitions come up. And so that's part of why those trends in the population range-wide collecting of data can be really important, so that we can make those informed, and Fish and Wildlife can make those informed decisions. Yes?
Yes, I wanted to ask about ranchers shooting them. Aren't they a popular thing to shoot them?
Yes, people do like to hunt prairie dogs. And because they're not listed, there are no restrictions as far as, impacting an endangered species. In Arizona, we do have a season for them. We close the season during the breeding season, just so, not impacting animals while they've got young below ground. And we're one of the few states that have that. Most states do not have any sort of season. They do not have bag limits. It's pretty open, free range to hunt them. And it's a pretty popular sport. Any other questions? Okay. All right. So I think I mentioned, yes, we would definitely estimate acreage more than population. Prairie dogs live in these social colonies it's a colony itself, but within them they have these family groups. They're called coteries. And so you'll often hear biologists refer to the coteries of ferrets, or of prairie dogs. We spend a lot of time doing disease management work because it seems to be one of the biggest threats to ferrets is just the loss of their prey. So we spend a lot of time trying to figure out what are best strategies for killing fleas and how to kill as many of them for as long as possible. And there's a lot of research that we've done to find some of the best products and the best dosages, and some things change, of course, over time. Sometimes our products end up having flea resistance. It's just a lot of different things sometimes that come up. But watching their parasite counts is really how we establish whether or not these disease management techniques right now work. And so our current method has been using a product called fipronil, which is the same active ingredient that's in your dog and cat medicine. It's a bait form or in a grain form. You can put it out, prairie dogs eat it, fleas bite them, it kills the fleas. And so it so far has been one of our best products that we've had out there. Before this we were using something else that was only lasting like 9 months, and this product is actually working for about 2 years. So we're finding we're always finding new products that work much better, and so our strategy's kind of ever changing, but as long as it's getting better, that's great. And whenever we do prairie dog surveys, sometimes because they're colonial, they communicate with each other a lot. And so we a lot of times can't do surveys if it's too hot or too windy. So if there's not a lot of them above ground because it's too hot, or if it's too windy and they can't hear each other, that's very restrictive for us sometimes to do those surveys because it's just not very active times for the animal. So we'll move on to black-tailed prairie dogs. This project is, like I said, black-tailed prairie dogs are definitely a prey for black-footed ferrets. We hope to have enough of them someday that they can support ferrets, but at this point it's still a reestablishment project. We still have too small of acreage to support ferrets, but because they were extirpated from the state, they are a higher priority species for us, and we've been working on reestablishment since 2008. Black-tailed prairie dogs are similar toGunnisons, but they actually have some pretty key differences. They are a little larger of an animal. They have more babies per year, surprisingly enough. They don't hibernate like a Gunnison's. They may spend more time below ground in a torpor state, but they don't technically hibernate. They have a much wider range. Gunnisons are only found in our Four Corners region, where blacktails are found from Mexico all the way up into Canada, which is surprising that they don't hibernate and they go all the way up to Canada. But the one thing they do have in common is they're both considered keystone species. So if you take a prairie dog out of its landscape and you remove that whole population from the system, they say that whole system will change in its absence, because it's, manipulating its environment. It is a common area for predators to come to feed. It has a burrow system where other animals rely on for shelter. So when you remove that animal, that whole system, everything changes by removing it. So that's what they mean by a keystone species. So in Arizona, as I mentioned, they were extirpated, and that's a good map ofGunnisons across the north, blacktails. They're historically down in southeastern Arizona. And in the early 1900s across the state, there was a campaign to get rid of as many prairie dogs as possible. And so, aren't we proud? We were actually successful with black-tailed prairie dogs. Didn't manage to eliminate all theGunnisons, we were able to get rid of all the blacktails. So that left us with a pretty vacant area down in southeastern Arizona and a big effort to try to bring them back. So the last one was seen in 1961, and it took a couple of decades before people were ready to bring them back to Arizona. There were several petitions, as I mentioned. There's been consistently petitioned for listing for protection under the Endangered Species Act. So those petitions were made several times in that time frame. Never successfully listed a candidate species for a while, but they were removed from that in 2008. And part of what they acknowledged when they said that they weren't warranted for listing was some of the work we were doing in Arizona. So that was helpful, that, because we were actively reestablishing in our state, it gave them further strength to say that this listing wasn't warranted at the time. So right now, we've got a couple of different populations down in southeastern Arizona. I think everybody thought that we were going to release them and they'd spread like wildfire, but after 15 years worth of work, we were still actually at only a couple hundred acres down there, where in the management plan that was written before me suggested that they could get to 7,200 acres in 10 years. That has not happened. And I'll get to some of those challenges coming up too. So, southeastern Arizona, this is our study area. If you guys have been to southeastern Arizona, Sonoya is right there, the Los Angeles National Conservation Area. That is where we have had several populations established. And then there's a private landowner in the eastern part of the state where we've had some releases on his property. But most of it has been on the Bureau of Land Management, their lands down there in Los Angeles. So, as I mentioned, we were trying to get to 7,100 acres of black-tailed prairie dogs. That's our goal, and it's been slow going. We would like to have them in 3 out of the 4 counties where they were historically, southeastern Arizona. And, among these colonies, we'd like to have enough connectivity that they can disperse among them and between them. Not just release these colonies and they're all very distinct and isolated. That's not going to work either. The way we monitor is much different than how we doGunnisons. This is reestablishment, and we're not talking about tens of thousands of acres. We're talking about 200. So our management is very different. We do semi-annual trapping. In the spring, we're looking at reproductive condition and how many pups we think they're having. And in the fall, we're looking at more the survivorship, and that gives us kind of our estimate of a population after the juveniles have had a chance to kind of see who's going to live and move on. And after our trapping, we do visual counts each season to just make sure that we're monitoring what's happening throughout each season. And we're watching contraction and expansion of those active burrows. So we'll go out and perimeter map those colonies once a year to see whether we think it's growing smaller or is it just kind of maintaining. And because there's small populations with very limited numbers of prairie dogs, they can't always maintain the vegetation themselves. Another big difference between a black-tailed prairie dog and a Gunnison prairie dog is the amount of vegetation that they'll tolerate.Gunnisons, as you may have seen, have a lot of, brushy stuff in their colony. Snakeweed, sometimes, they can tolerate so much more brush. It is sometimes hard to distinguish where the edge of a colony is in a Gunnison colony. Black-tails are the opposite. If they have a blade of grass that's growing in their way and it's bothering them, they'll clip it off just to get it out of their way. And so it is a very clean, distinct clip line. Is actually, you can monitor these populations sometimes by satellite. So satellites are up in the space that can look down and can define the edge of a black-tailed prairie dog colony. Can't do that with the Gunisons, but you can with a black-tailed. So when we have some really big monsoons in a small population, sometimes we have way more vegetation that grows than the prairie dogs can handle, and that makes them really susceptible to predators. So sometimes we're down there mowing prairie dog lawns, and I know that sounds really silly, but again, this is, you know, we're talking like 10 acres, not 30,000. So yeah, we do remove mesquite, we do mow lawns, we do make sure that they keep that clear viewpoint, and they can constantly be watching for the predators around them. And we've had some really poor springs and really poor reproduction from that. They don't like having babies when they don't have food to eat. And so we have started supplemental feeding just during the breeding season. So in March, when they want to start, finding each other and getting busy, then that's when we start feeding, and then we stop usually in about June or July, depending on when the monsoons start and something green grows. Because once the green grass grows, they're not interested in the food anymore. They want the real veg. But at least helps us boost that reproduction. Because it's a reestablishment effort, we only have a couple hundred prairie dogs. We don't have any hunting opportunities for black-tailed prairie dogs in southeastern Arizona. The hunting season is completely closed. If you ever want to go out and get good pictures, that's a great place to go get pictures of prairie dogs, because they don't get hunted. They're much more friendly. If we ever did open up hunting, I'm gonna have to haze the crap out of them, because they're just they do get very photogenic right now, some of them. So some of the challenges we have with this program, number one being release locations. So as I mentioned, southeastern Arizona, it took them a little while to be ready for us to bring black-tailed prairie dogs. And we made some concessions with landowners when we were establishing the management plan for them. So we made the compromise that we would not release black-tailed prairie dogs within 2 miles of a private landowner who's not supportive of the project, which doesn't seem like much, but it really does reduce the amount of options that are out there for us for releasing. We've had several landowners who are interested, but finding that 1 mile completely venting of the whole area, that is really hard to find landowners who have that kind of property. So trying to find those locations has been difficult, and we're constantly working with landowners to try to work out agreements with them and or their neighbors. A lot of the grasslands down in southeastern Arizona, I know you guys have a lot of juniper encroachment on your grasslands down up here. Southern Arizona, it's mesquite. So we find a lot of mesquite encroaching in our grasslands, and areas that we do want to work, we end up having to remove a lot of mesquite before we can get in there. Prairie dogs are great at maintaining the mesquite once you remove it, but if you don't have them, then you do need to maintain and constantly come back and watch for that regrowth of mesquite. So it's an ongoing effort, definitely keeping up on the grassland habitat. As I mentioned, the drought issue, it's hard to reestablish animals when you're not getting the rains that you really need, not having them reproduce and self-sustaining. It's a tough thing. Can't make water fall from the sky as much as I try. Luckily for us in southern Arizona, we have not had the disease issues like we do withGunnisons. We've had plague that is definitely active throughout our Gunnison's prairie dogs across northern Arizona, but we haven't had plague in southern Arizona since 1984. So luckily we have escaped that threat at the moment. Never know when that can rear its ugly head, but for now we haven't had to deal with that. And then encouraging dispersal. So the colonies that we have and we've put there and we do all this work, like I said, everybody thought they'd spread like wildfire, but they don't. We're still sitting in just these few hundred acres even after all this time. And so encouraging these animals to grow and spread has been actually a challenge. And I think that people are kind of always surprised to hear that with prairie dogs. So, and I think that is my last slide. Yeah. All right.
For the ferrets,
facilities across the nation that all contribute to the captive breeding program for black-footed ferrets. 4 of them being strictly zoos. One is the Smithsonian, and then they actually have, the Fish and Wildlife runs what's called the Black-footed Ferret Center, and that's where they have captive breeding there. All the animals from the captive breeding centers all go to that central facility, the Ferret Center, and that's where they have preconditioning pads. And so all the animals have to go through preconditioning prior to being released. And the program couldn't persist without it. A lot of endangered species, if people disappeared, the animals would do much better. Ferrets are actually the one right now, because of plague, that would not make it without us, because they have not had that time to evolve and have that resistance to plague. They constantly need our help and support to be able to be resistant to it, unfortunately. So, gotta figure that one out. Just need more technology, more time. They were able to get rabies somewhat under control, and I'm sure there's ways with plague. We just don't know how yet. Yes.
What organization or group puts these medications and immunizations for you to give to these wild animals?
The Fish and Wildlife Service is the one in charge of they have the vaccine. They actually, whenever we're going to be doing work, we reach out to them. They put it together, whatever the substances
Where
are.
are they located?
In Colorado. Yes, they're right outside of Fort Collins. But they do work with like the Wildlife Health Center in Wisconsin and USGS and those kind of organizations. They're the researchers behind who create those vaccines, but then they usually put them in the hands of Fish and Wildlife to administer give to the different release sites to administer. Yes.
In Colorado, when I lived there, they had a law where you had to remove the prairie dog, you couldn't kill them if you wanted to develop it. I don't know if they saw that law, and it was great, but they ran out of places to put them. Would Arizona be able to take a batch of prairie dogs if they wanted to remove them from their site in Colorado?
Yes, but I think the majority, well, it depends. So I think a lot of the ones that are being moved are the black-tailed prairie dogs. Colorado has really weird legislation where you can't move animals out of the county without legislative approval. So you have, yes, their legislation is much more involved. So you would have to get their legislation involved to have that approved before you could even move them out of the county. And I don't make those rules. So I mean, not to say that we wouldn't take them, but would they be willing, you need Colorado willing to let them move to begin with. It gets really, in Kansas, if you have prairie dogs on your land and your neighbor doesn't want them, he can call the county and the county will come out and remove the prairie dogs and send you the bill. So it gets really weird with how some of this legislation is set up in some states. It depends on where you are and what your state laws are. Yes.
In Arizona, how friendly have private landowners like ranchers been towards efforts to maintain connectivity so that animals can move from one colony to another? And is that changing at all over time?
It's very hit and miss. You've got some that are really big players. In northern Arizona, I have the Babbitts. They've been extremely helpful with ferret releases, and when there's development happening in Flagstaff and they are wanting to move prairie dogs, the Babbitts are usually the first to take those prairie dogs and have them released on their properties. But then there are others, yes, that just won't even let game and fish on their property at all. And is it ideal? Of course not, but you just try to find other ways to work around. You try to, if ranchers are willing to listen, or landowners in general, then we're always open to having a conversation and try to continue to work out. I don't think any of us are trying to force animals on their property, but figure out ways that we can work together. But if you're going to be stood, sometimes they just never trust the government as well. You get a little bit of everything out there. But I think there's enough big players that we're able to keep moving forward. It's not like standardized as far as surveying small mammals across the state. You know, I have a limited amount of time and effort to put in, and so I'm able to survey in some areas, and then you also take advantage of other people who are doing work. You know, anybody who's doing small mammal trapping in the state has to have a scientific collecting license from Arizona Game and Fish, and at the end of the year they have to report that data to us. And so sometimes I also rely on data that comes from other people who are working out there as well, because I can't get everywhere, and why should I also have to if there's other people collecting it, and be efficient in your job, right? So I mean, try to work with the data that's also coming in from other people as well. So I can't say it's a very standardized way of surveying the state, and that's why, I mean, there's plenty of animals that are on that species of greatest conservation need list that are just sometimes unknowns. I don't know if they still exist in certain areas, and so it's difficult. I have a wish list of a way that I'd love to move forward and monitor across the state, but that requires a lot of money, and again, efficiency and trying to do with what I have, with the budgets that I have. Who else? Any other questions? Yes?
Did you say how large the black-footed ferret population is now?
Well, across the nation, it's about 400 in the wild. The best population is going to be up in the Badlands in South Dakota. They probably have the best population across the nation is in that area. Arizona did really well for a while. We had a population of 123 when we were back in 2012. And unfortunately right now, we think we're back at 0. We had a lot of plague come through, and it was really tricky for us. We had, prairie plague usually kills 90 to 100% of prairie dogs. And in our ferret area, we didn't have that happen. And so we still have prairie dogs, and we've been tracking them year to year, and we've been finding them testing positive for plague year to year. And that's what we assume and why we missed plague being our culprit, because like I said, we were expecting animals to be disappearing if we were dealing with plague, and that wasn't the case. So it was a little bit of our naivety, but we've learned from that, and now we've got a different strategy as far as, like, we know we have to actually be tracking these animals, collecting blood and fleas off of them to monitor them, not just trusting the fact of presence of an absence survey can tell us whether or not we've got active plague or not, which is usually a very pretty trusty method in other areas, but it was something that we missed, and we've been working now that we feel like we've got a handle on it. We've been doing disease management, killing fleas out in that area for four years straight now, and so we want to start releasing ferrets again. Our holdup right now is drought, because we didn't have any winter rains. We haven't had a monsoon this year. The prairie dogs we did trap didn't have any babies really this year, so we were kind of concerned about our prey base for ferrets, but we'd love to start releasing again. We feel like the disease part of it's handled, or at least, being addressed. But now we just need a stable population of prairie dogs for those ferrets, so we can start doing releases again. If we can, we have a release plan on September 8th, but right now we're really nervous about it because we haven't had any monsoons, so we're still unsure whether we're even going to accept that allocation or tell Fish and Wildlife to find them a new home. We're playing that one by ear. We do what's best for the animals, even though we really want to get back in the game. Yes?
Possibly, could any of those prairie dogs be resistant to the plague?
Yeah, and we've been doing a genetic study. We've had a researcher come out and start pulling blood and looking at whether or not, and that's a possibility. And compared to, we also have another ferret release site that never really took off because we have a lot of plague up there, the SB, and comparing the prairie dogs from the two, there's a distinct difference between survivorship between them. So there is definitely something that's unique about those Aubrey Valley prairie dogs. And yeah, now we wonder, can we take those genetics and start sprinkling them around the state? Can we start, speeding along evolution? Is that something we can do? But this is all new information that we've just been getting in the last year from our geneticist, so. Yeah.
You said you had a release plan.
Yes.
How many ferrets do you have that you're holding, and where do you keep them?
They are being held in Fort Collins at that ferret center right now. And so on September 8th, we would send a plane up and have them picked up in little carriers and flown out here, and we would release them in the evening time, sometime then. And we would expect 15 is what we would hope to release. That's what we're allocated. It's just whether or not we want to accept it. Yes.
I had a question on the extirpation of the prairie dogs. What was the rationale for doing that? And if that rationale still exists, is there compensation available for those people who might be affected?
It was seen as competition with cattle, not only the forage availability, but also the threat of livestock stepping in burrows and breaking legs is always the concern. Yes, there's still those concerns out there, and we have proposed to have some sort of landowner incentive program. Colorado's got an excellent landowner incentive program, and so we've tried to mimic what they have going on there. They have some programs through their NRCS, and so far we haven't been able to get the NRC board here in Arizona to buy into it, but it's something that we have been trying to push, something that would financially compensate ranchers for just leaving the prairie dogs alone on the property.
Kind of like wolves.
It's similar, yeah, the livestock depredation with wolves, it's similar. Instead of, losing livestock, we're just, asking to leave the prairie dogs alone.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
I've heard both sides where no, cattle do not break their legs, and, then of course the other side, yes, they do. Or horses.
My opinion. I think that it happens. I will never tell a rancher that it doesn't. It's absolutely, there's certain situations I've heard that are definitely where there's more prone to happen than not. Situations where they're separating moms from calves, and the moms are really, already very aggravated, and heard of thunder, lightning storms that spook animals where that happens. I also, though, think that there are a lot of things that live in the ground besides prairie dogs. I think prairie dogs are just one of the more conspicuous, so they get blamed a lot more often. But foxes, badgers, kangaroo rats, bunnies, there's a bunch of things that live out on the landscape. I just think prairie dogs get blamed for it more often than not. My opinion. Yes.
A good shot, a good rifleman with a gun, that's good, can decimate the whole colony. I heard of that, I was up at the golf course.
Yeah.
They hired someone, they got rid of the whole colony.
Small populations especially, that's why we don't have any sort of open hunting season for the blacktails, because there's such small colonies still that you could wipe out a colony very easily. And when you have 30,000 acres, that's a lot tougher for sure. It's gonna be really tough to wipe out a whole one, but small populations for sure have a much more risk with those hunters. Any other questions? You guys had a lot of great questions. All right, well, feel free to come up and ask me anything else after this. I'll